introduce you to my friend Shivendra.
Thank you, Wim. What do you think about the film?
I think it's not really a film, it's more of an experience. I thought of it much more of an experience than of making a movie, because it's not like other movies. You live through something and somehow it's an experience. So I hope you have experienced something.
Let's hear from you guys. The questions are to you. Yeah. Can we have a mics? Are there mics here for people?
I can project.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
all right.
Here you have a...
I don't know how to communicate with words after this experience. I'm a therapist myself, so the affect, the emotion in the film was profound. Especially the psychoanalytic quality of like the childhood and the socio-political stuff coming up. I have a question about the heart and one about the craft. The heart question being, the art that you sort of documented touched mythical aspect of things, so much loss, but also sort of transcending and dancing with the abyss and the unknown. So I'm wondering, in that process, what touched you? Like, how was your encounter with the unknown, with the loss, and with the transcendental aspect of Anselm?
The unknown is just calling. You're right. I mean, as Anselm's art touches on so many things, and as it cannot be categorized, and as some of his work goes into territories that are not usually connected to art, like metaphysics, religion, myth. He's not really thinking that art or painting, because he's really a painter, he doesn't think that painting is reduced to anything. There is nothing that escapes painting, and therefore it was first a little unimaginable how I could do justice to him. And so the first thing I told him when we agreed to make a film was that I would have to come several times. And I didn't know how often, but one beautiful thing about documentaries is you don't have just one shot. So, and I had warned him that I needed many efforts to visit him and each time advance a little bit more. So we shot 7 times. We each time shot like a week, 10 days, and after the 7th time I felt I had covered it. And in between I also always was able to shoot, to go back to my editing room and edit and look at what I shot and try to put it together and find out what it is I was still missing. So next time I could dig deeper. So over 3 years we shot 7 times, and in between I was always going back to my editing room, and that was during the pandemic, so I had quite some time, and because we were shooting in his studio on his own territory, we were allowed to film. I mean, we had to obey the rules and all having masks and stuff. But it was in a time when I was able to dedicate a lot of time to this project. So, and each time I was learning better how to get closer to him and how to find out more where his source of wisdom or energy or spirituality was. And only after 3 or 4 times I realized I had to film him also as a young man when nobody knew him, and I had to reenact this part of his life, 10 years when nobody ever saw him. He was unknown, he worked in the forest, he lived there with his family, but nobody in the art world, not a single gallerist or museum director or art historian ever heard of him. He worked for 10 years before he first came out, and most of his work was set. So I felt I had to go into that time as well. And luckily I found that his son really looked very much like his father, so I cast his son. And then I realized even more important would be to shed a light on his childhood, because it felt to me that this was an important time in his life, and actually part of his, what makes him so special is that I realized he had kept the child he had been in himself, and he had access to the child he once was, and that child in him gave him a lot of strength to do impossible things, because children can do impossible things, and he was still a child. So slowly I got closer and closer, and I felt I was able to fulfill his only demand that he had on me. Because before we started the movie, I asked him, what do you expect from the film? Tell me. And he said, I don't expect anything, but come to think of it, there's one thing I would like you to do. I want you to surprise me. And I felt at the end, yes, I had done it. Oh, yes, thank you.
Hello.
Afterwards we're going to get to you.
I felt so mesmerized about the poetry part of it. I felt the visual was a poetry, and the words that were recited, that was something else. And being from the poetry background, I would like to ask you, who is your favorite poet and some of your favorite poems?
It was in this film and through Anselm that I discovered a German poet who never lived in Germany, but who lived in France for most of his life and was born on the outer parts of what was Germany in the 30s, what is now Romania, and his name was Paul Celan. I didn't know much about Paul Celan, and as he's an important figure in Anselm's own mythology, and as he is an important collaborator, although they never met, but Anselm drew a lot from Paul Celan and from Paul Celan's knowledge of German history and from the power of Celan's poetry. So I got to know Celan through Anselm, and I was very grateful. Anselm has used his poetry for a lot of the words that appear in his paintings. So, and I discovered an amazing poet who was almost forgotten in Germany. And Anselm sort of created a monument to his poetry. And I discovered him through this film, and I know all his writings, and he is really a very powerful figure insofar as he was a Jewish poet, but his mother tongue was German, and he suffered very much from the Germans. Both his parents died in the through the Nazis. So, and he still had to write in the language of the perpetrators. So, and it was a sort of a tragic life, but then again, I think a very poignant poet in the 20th century through that. So, he was somebody I met through Anselm, and I really had to know everything he had written, and I'm very thankful to Anselm that he introduced me to Paul Celan. And the poet that meant more in my own life than anybody else is Rainer Maria Rilke, a German poet who is decently translated into English, but as poetry goes, a lot of poetry cannot really be translated. It can be, you can say what the words are, but you cannot really translate the poetry. So Rilke is very important to me. And Rilke is somebody I read extensively before I made the film Wings of Desire, and the idea that there's angels in the sky over Berlin owes a lot to Rilke, because a lot of his poems are populated by angels. Thank you. So, and with a beautiful yellow t-shirt.
Hi, Wim. So it was a really, really beautiful experience, and it was, as he said, it was profound. So for me, the question is, I had a very surreal shift in me while watching this film. That is, the film was poetic, the film was so novel, and it was a film. My question is, I was an observer and I was a listener. So I observed the paintings and I listened to the stories that you told. So why this kind of making, and how did you approach? Why this approach?
See, the most difficult thing in agreeing to make a film with and about Anselm Kiefer and his work was how to even represent it. I mean, how to put people in front of his work. Because I didn't want to make a film that was going to explain the man or explain the work. He's not explaining it himself. A lot of it is inexplicable. But if you look at it in a book, it is not even so impressive. But if you're in front of it, it is something very powerful. So I realized my job was to put you in front of it. Not to explain it and not to teach you anything about the man, but to put you in front of his paintings. And that's why I took the approach of doing it in 3D, because that puts you into his space and makes you realize also the dimensions, because some of his work is extravagantly big, and I mean, even big is the wrong word. It's really large. It's also not the right word. It is out of proportion. And to feel that, I think I felt 3D was the right medium. Also in 3D you take in so much more than normally on a screen. So, and I felt all that was necessary to do justice to his work. And then again, I mean, this is only a little part of his creations. You saw the big studio in which he drives around with his bicycle. That is pretty big, right? There's 4 of them. And I only shot in 1, because I felt I could only handle 1. So Anselm is larger than life, and then again, somehow I think that when you come out of the film, you have a gut feeling who he is and who he might be and what his art could mean to you. But things about artists always raise the question, do you explain or do you just show? And I choose to only show, to make you guess what he's doing. Thank you.
He was here in Mumbai last year. He had come to Mumbai.
Yes, if I had continued the film, I would have been there too.
Yeah.
So it's quite intriguing that this constellation of Ingeborg Bachmann, Martin Heidegger, and Paul Celan, and especially the whole reference to the just like in our house, the science, the house of being, and Heidegger's tragically this being to death, sein zum Tode. So these, if I call it in German, the düstere Stimmung, and interestingly, the method of painting is a lot of burning also. So that, work with the ruins, I mean, it's quite striking that the work evolves out of this process of making the art. And I mean, my impression was like Nietzsche say, how the artist become the artwork. So that personification also I can see. But I'm quite interested in this constellation of Bachmann, Heidegger, and Porcelain. Was it from Kiefer or from yourself that interest came from?
I mean, it's all present in his work. And Ingeborg Bachmann is another German poet that influenced Anselm and that he himself quotes quite often in his work. And Martin Heidegger is the philosopher that shows up at several instances in his work and that he's quoting also. So, I mean, you probably realized that the film has a lot to do with German history of the 20th century, but especially after the war. And of course that is something that connects Anselm and me very much, because he was born in a couple of months before the war started. He was actually born in a hospital during an air raid of the city, and his mother had Anselm as a baby during an airstrike in an underground hospital. So he, in a way, came into the world still during the war, and I was born a couple of months later. So for some reason, or not for some reason, we certainly lived through some of the same childhood traumas when we were little. The ruins and the aftermath of Nazism. And both Anselm and I remember clearly that all our teachers were still Nazis. I mean, I painfully had to come to terms as I grew older that most of my teachers had been former Nazis, because there weren't many teachers left and after the war, because so many men had died. And Germans had sort of dealt with the issue not too thoroughly afterwards, and they needed everybody. And so they even took teachers who had taught during the Nazi regime and had been ardent Nazis. So Anselm really remembers quite drastically that he was brought up by former Nazis in his childhood. I also remember some of these. So we still suffered from the aftermath, and we're also very much aware of the guilt question that the Germans were exposed to after the war, and sort of slowly realizing the dimensions of what had happened, what Germans had done to the Jewish people. Slowly it sank in and it became public knowledge, even if a lot of people were denying it still after the war. All this is part of the subtext of the film, and all of this is part of why Anselm decided to become who he is, because he revolted against it, and his whole work, his whole life in a way is a statement of clarification. So that had to happen. And as Heidegger, for some part of his life, was also sympathizing with the Nazis, and then sort of was half re-accepted after the war and was even teaching again, and is a very critical figure in post-war Germany. So all of this came into the subtext of the film, and I had to sort of face all of this, because that's what produced his art, was that he was born in that time, and that he confronted this time, more than any other German artist.
Every day that you get to say hi to a legend, a giant of his field, hi Wim.
Hi.
My question is this, you have been like associated with like other giants of various art fields, like right from your college days, whether it's Nicholas Ray, Pina, now the film we just watched. What attracts you to artists? Is it their art, or, I mean, all these people were larger than life personalities too. So is it the personality that attracts you to them, or it's the art that brings you closer to them?
I don't think it's the personality, but it's, of course, you cannot separate it from the personality. But see, when I grew up and when I watched movies as a child, and even when I started to make films, the idea of an adventure was to go someplace where nobody had ever been and travel the world. And even shooting a film in the American West was still, like Paris, Texas, was still partly an adventure. But the older I get, the more I realized there weren't any adventures left on this planet. Everybody had been everywhere, and planet Earth was no longer the adventure. The real adventure, I realized more and more and more, was people's minds. And some artists who got into territory of the German mind where never, of the human mind where never anybody had been before. So, and I felt that Pina Bausch had taken me into a territory where even movies had not been before. Or Sebastião Salgado had been a photographer who had taken so much of human suffering into his own life that I wondered how he could have survived. And I loved his photography and I wanted to make a film on him. And then I discovered what had saved him, and that it had been nature. And that he really had become a discoverer of how to replant the rainforest. The first man who ever dared to reforest the rainforest and learn how to do it. So these are, for me, the real adventurers. So I think of these films as adventure movies, and also Anselm for me is an adventure movie, and the last adventure is really the human mind, I feel, the biggest adventure left. And I don't care if anybody goes to the Mars, but I think some minds do more amazing things than going to Mars. Okay. So over there.
Yeah, it's you.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how important do you think, not just for Germany, but for all countries to remember their history in its entirety, not just the good, but all the bad and the ugly that they might have done to others or that exist within their realm?
That's a great question. Thank you. See, Anselm's work is part of the answer, because his big ethos, and I think the whole creative force behind his work is to fight against forgetting. And the only thing that is helping us to not fall into the trap of forgetting is to know history. And history could possibly save us from committing the same mistakes mankind has committed before. So for somebody like Anselm, not forgetting is almost his biggest task as an artist. And as a filmmaker, and as there's the whole history of cinema that Trivandrum is also dedicated to restoring, the whole history reminds us and shows us that not forgetting is the biggest treasure of our culture. And that we can only face the future if we do not forget. And cinema can help, and artists can help, and I think it's one of the great things that movies can do is fight forgetfulness. People, like today, in the age of digital media and social media and all of that, there's so many false things being said, and history is as if it had never happened. See, the other day I heard somebody say, in America, but even in Germany, Hitler was a communist. I mean, serious discussion in America, because they said his party was the National Socialist Party, so he had to be a socialist, so meaning he was a communist. And actually people maintain that. And in America, they said it to discredit socialism or communism. Hitler was a communist. You see how bad it was? But, I mean, our only help against that is to know history and to be able to contradict and say, this is a lie. And I think knowing history is a great responsibility, and one of the beautiful things that movies help is to not forget.
Yeah, thank you. We are facing a very similar. Am I right? Yeah. We know what we are going through. The history is being changed.
Yeah, I know. But everywhere, these populists pretend they reinvent history. They can reinvent history, but it's a terrible thing to do, to interpret history.
And the social media is now the really tool of reaching out to so many people. And
Goebbels would have loved to have Instagram.
I know, Goebbels would have been, he would have been.
Yeah. He would have loved to have these tools and people using it according to his handbook now.
And that's what is being
The
used.
more you insist on lies, the more people believe it.
But we have Goebbels here. Yeah.
Well, not only here, you know. So, long live cinema to fight against
Long listen.
all the Goebbels of the world.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good night and see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much.